We're in Manchester. The Conservatives start their conference here today, some 16 points adrift in the polls. Heaven knows, they're miserable now. The Tories are hoping that Rishi will bring them a happy Monday. But he still won't say if high-speed rail to the north is about to get the elbow. But we're not sure if everyone in the cabinet is singing from the same song sheet. We'll see if Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, can bring some new order to the Conservative message. We'll talk to Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, on tax cuts, immigration and more. Ian Murray, Labour's shadow Scottish Secretary, on whether the Reds can take Rutherglen in Thursday's by-election. And Mick Whelan, the train drivers' leader, on strikes and Starmer. With us throughout the morning, two political insiders about to launch the podcast you've been waiting for. Politico's Jack Blanchard and Sky's own Sam Coates. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Both City and United lost yesterday. It rained, and the Tories rolled into town. But here at the conference centre, they seem to be quite cheerful. Nobody here was singing Blue Moon last night. Perhaps buoyed by polling that suggests a whisper of recovery in recent days. Still, there are 4 days for Tory discord to emerge. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have already been firing off salvos from the sidelines. And we've got plenty of sounds for you this morning. Let us start with Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Trevor.
What are you expecting the Prime Minister to give us this week?
Well, I think the Prime Minister will be drawing a contrast between the long-term decisions that he's taking and the approach that Labour would take in office, which essentially would be a continuity of the short-term, to my mind, superficial approach that has scarred politics in the past. And the Prime Minister, I think, in particular, will be laying out the progress we're making on the economy, dealing with inflation, making sure that we continue to bear down on inflation. Dealing with inflation provides people with the biggest tax cut of all. I also expect that the Prime Minister will be laying out a vision for change in education, on levelling up, and in the NHS.
OK. Every Conservative minister I've interviewed on this programme claims to be a low-tax Tory. You've already set that out this morning. But during the past decade, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, tax increases have cost Britain £3,500 per household. The tax burden's going to rise to over 37% by 2027. Your claim to be a low-tax Tory is just fantasy, isn't it?
No. I think it's important to recognise that whenever we can, we do cut taxes. And when David Cameron and George
my
Osborne...
point is you haven't been very successful. I know you say that every time, but literally keeps going up.
I think there are two things to bear in mind. The first thing is that when we dealt effectively with the economic mess that Labour left us in 2010, we were in a position to cut taxes then. Since then, however, there have been two seismic global events. The worst pandemic for a century, and war on the continent of Europe for the first time, certainly on this scale, since 1945. And that's had an impact, and not just on our economy, but on every economy. And in those circumstances, particularly after the pandemic, then we've had to necessarily ensure that the tax take is in a position to be able to cover the costs of furlough and the costs of recovery.
Yeah, let me just reel back on that. The IFS, like I quoted a moment ago, says that the shift that you've created is decisive and permanent. And let's remember, since you had before we had COVID, there were all sorts of other things going on. The IFS says this shift is not wholly to do with COVID. You really have become, and there may be no shame in this, you have become a high-tax party.
No, I would gently disagree with the IFS. In the past, I've taken issues with some of these organisations with acronyms that have got things wrong in the past.
Michael, come on, stop it. These people can add up. You know that.
But they're making a projection. So, of course it is the case that taxes are higher than we would want them to be. That is a fact, and it's one that, as I say, I believe is due principally to the pandemic, but also to an extent to the war in Ukraine. They're making a prediction for the future. We've just seen, in the course of the last couple of weeks, that other organisations have made predictions about the trend rate of growth in the UK, and those organisations have been proven wrong. We're growing faster than France, faster than Germany, all, as some would have it, despite Brexit. And so you'll forgive me for taking with a pinch of salt predictions about what we're likely to do in the future.
OK, so what taxes are we going to have cut?
Well, again, it's for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to decide. My own view is that wherever possible, we should cut taxes on work. In other words, we should incentivise people to work harder. We should make sure that they're better rewarded for the enterprise, the effort, the endeavour that they put in.
So, national insurance?
Well, again, it is for the Prime Minister to decide.
I know the Chancellor will decide and all of that. But, you know, everybody says Michael Gove is the cleverest person in government. And it would just be interesting to hear what you think is possible. Let's start with this. National insurance, for example.
Well, I know that you'll run through a list and you'll invite me to say yes or no to each of them, but I won't. And I'm going to do, and I know it's irritating when people are asked direct questions not to answer, but I can't answer because it's the Chancellor who does it, and he...
The voters are watching, I mean, many of them are watching, and they're thinking, if Gove doesn't know, that means that nobody in the government knows, and it's a bit not reassuring that you don't have a view. I'm not asking you to predict what the Chancellor would do. I'm just asking you, what do you think, if there were going to be tax cuts between now and the election, where might they come from?
Well, it's extraordinarily flattering of you to think that people assume that I am the source of wisdom on this. But I think people are actually reassured that the government is concentrating, firstly, on dealing with inflation, as I said right at the very beginning. If you bring inflation down, that's the biggest tax cut, the biggest relief on people's cost of living that there is, then there is an opportunity to decide. The discussion about where the tax burden should fall, I think, is one that we need to take, not now, but in a little bit's time.
All right, well, let's just deal with timing.
Yeah.
Should there be a reduction in the tax burden on individuals before the next election? Are we talking the next year? Are we talking 3 years? Are we talking 5 years?
Yes, no, I would like to see the tax burden reduced before the next election.
Thank you. That's because there are some people who say, including, I think, the Chancellor, that might not be possible. But in your estimation, it ought to be possible, given what you've seen of the economy and so on.
I think the critical thing is that we absolutely need to make sure that we are bringing inflation down. And as I say, naturally, everyone in the Conservative Party believes in lowering tax and particularly seeing hard work rewarded. But I can't speculate on what type of tax cut, if any, we're able to deliver until we are certain that inflation is coming down.
Can I ask you about one other thing? That there's some talk about welfare benefits being cut. The Chancellor spoke in an interview in the last couple of days about welfare spending being cut through efficiencies. And I'm wondering what you think about one of the things that's being talked about. Would that include, for example, means testing the winter fuel allowance for the elderly?
No, I think the Chancellor was very clear that he was talking about the capacity of technology to ensure that services are better delivered.
I know, he says AI will save us in various ways, but I think he also said that there ought to be efficiencies. And I'm wondering, because you've been very thoughtful on the issues of what it means to be a Conservative and compassionate conservatism and all of that. And I'm curious where you stand on this, because there are some people, for example, when I say some people, I'm talking about me, who would say that the subsidy of £500 to rich pensioners like me, who can afford to heat our homes and can watch Sky Sport without that subsidy, is really unfair and it shouldn't be protected. Now, when the Prime Minister talked about being courageous, isn't that the sort of decision that you ought to be taking, a courageous decision for the long term?
I absolutely take the point. I can see the point that you're making. Of course, it's entirely open to any pensioner, if they feel that they're in a position to, if you felt that
It's very difficult, I can tell you.
if you felt that you were in a position to...
I know, you're going to say, why don't you return it? It's hard.
If you want to. But the critical thing is, I think when we're looking at welfare overall, the question that I would ask, because it's a philosophical point, is how do we make sure that our welfare system encourages people into work? And I think one of the things that both the Chancellor and Mel Stride, our wonderful Work and Pension Secretary, want to do is to look at the help that we give people in Job Centre Plus and elsewhere in order to get them back into work. One of our biggest problems in this country is that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are economically inactive. Now, in many cases, they need help and support. They've been living with mental health problems or physical health problems, which require attention. What we want to do is to have a sensitive welfare system that provides support for people through difficult times, but helps them back into work.
All right, let's talk about the issue de nos jours, as it were, rail, high-speed rail and all of that.
Yes.
Boris Johnson, your old friend,
Yes.
the man you wanted to be Prime Minister until you decided you could do it better, said on Friday that in the universities of Beijing, they teach a course in political science in which they dwell, as you might expect, on the disadvantages of democracy. And their theme is HS2, where the contrast with Chinese high-speed rail is already embarrassing, if not, frankly, humiliating. Do you feel humiliated that you can't seem to make a decision about this?
No, I don't. I mean, I love Boris, but I think that taking our lessons from the University of Beijing and the Marxist-Leninist thought that is deployed there as the doctrine, which they are trying to indoctrinate people into.
They do get the trains to run, though, don't they?
Well, actually, if you look at the way in which the Chinese government and the Chinese state allocate capital and run infrastructure projects, they are liable to massive cost overruns and inefficiencies, and that's partly because their political system has bribery built into it and inefficiency built into it. But on your central point
about
HS2...
If I go to Shanghai, I can get on a train. I cannot get on a train from Birmingham to Manchester at high speed.
Well, actually, the journey is pretty effective and efficient, but your fundamental point, HS2, I think it is an important project. We have spades in the ground at the moment. If you were to look at the work that's going on now in order to make sure that links between London and Birmingham are built effectively, that work is proceeding at pace. However, we do need to look at value for money, and the costs of this project have been significantly greater than originally estimated. And as Conservatives, we need to make sure that we're getting value for money from every pound that the taxpayer gives us.
Are you saying that you think that it's possible that Birmingham to Manchester, which is the bit where there aren't spades in the ground, as you put it, may have to give way to other priorities?
Well, again, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Transport Secretary are looking at this issue now. I am a supporter of strong and good transport links for the north, but it's important to recognise that transport links in the north of England also have to be improved between cities and within cities. Here in Manchester, we've given money and indeed new powers to Andy Burnham to make sure that he has an integrated transport network in Manchester. He's taken that money and those powers. That's brought real benefits.
Andy Burnham was on last week telling us all about that. How are you going to feel, Levelling Up Secretary,
yes,
when they say, this is not going to Manchester, we have already said we're not going to do the Liverpool to Leeds line. How are you going to feel when you have to come to the north again and say, we're going to do the levelling up, but actually you won't have the rail? How are you going to sell that to Andy Burnham, to the Mayor of Liverpool, to the Mayor of West Yorkshire and all of those people?
Well, I've got a good relationship with all of those mayors.
Well, you won't have when you tell them they can't have their rail line.
And the reason that we've got a good relationship is that we recognise that the most important thing to do is to empower them to pull a number of levers. So transport's important, absolutely, but skills and education is important also, and culture as well.
I understand what you're doing, Michael, but the deflection doesn't work here. What are you going to say to these people when you go and when you turn up in the north and say, I'm the Levelling Up Secretary, I'm doing the levelling up thing, and they say the one thing we wanted that would promote levelling up prosperity in the north is the one thing you're not doing.
No, I don't think they would say that. I mean, of course, if I were a mayor for any northern city, I would want the maximum amount of investment. I would fight for it, and they do so very effectively. But they all recognise that levelling up is about more than one project. The levelling up white paper made clear that what we need to do in order to level up is to invest in cities, but also in towns, as we are doing and as we've announced today, and also to make sure that, for example, everything from strengthening our universities through additional spending on research and development, through the enterprise zones that we've created, all of these come together in a rich mixture which enables levelling up. You don't bake a cake with only one ingredient.
I want to come to the towns ingredient in a moment. But what I'm trying to do is to understand what kind of conservatism we are in for if you return to government. Last week, the Home Secretary said that she thought that multiculturalism had failed in Europe, including here in Britain. Now, before you throw it back at me, I once did say that I thought we should avoid using this word because everybody who uses it means something different by it.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Tell me what you think Suella Braverman meant, and do you agree with her?
I'm pretty certain that Suella was making the point that we welcome people from a variety of different backgrounds. We always have. But it's important that we have a common culture in the United Kingdom, adherence to the rule of law, acceptance of and tolerance of different people and their approaches towards life. And it's a point that's been made by Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron and others, that if you're going to have a warm and welcoming home, then you need to have a consensus around certain shared liberal principles.
Yeah, let's take that in two parts. The warm and welcoming home on the barges doesn't seem that lovely. The warm and welcoming home that ships people off to Rwanda isn't exactly traditionally what you would associate with the British coming for a cup of tea, is it? Well, Suella Braverman is not offering a warm and welcoming welcome to immigrants, is she?
Yes, she is, because
the language that she used last week was not warm and welcoming.
You need to draw a distinction. I think we all recognise this between people who are coming here, who are fleeing persecution, and to whom we offer that warm welcome. The 200,000 people, for example, who've fled from Ukraine, the more than 100,000 people who've come from Hong Kong, the more than 20,000 people who've come from Afghanistan. Big numbers, and people who have UK taxpayers welcome them into their homes, and those people who are coming here, who are working with people smugglers and human traffickers, and who, as a result, find themselves placed in circumstances where their own lives are at risk. We can't have a situation where our borders are being exploited by criminal gangs. And that's why the Prime Minister and I completely back the Home Secretary in taking the steps necessary to deal with illegal migration.
I'm only cutting you off because I want to get onto some territory which I know you and I have discussed before, and which I think you have some pretty unique views about. Because the other part of her point, which is about multiculturalism and all of that, is not at all abstract for you. Last year, Bradford Council produced a report that said minority communities in that city had become more isolated, and specifically that the chances of interaction between minority and majority people in Bradford had declined by 20%. So when she talks about the failure of multiculturalism, is that what she means?
Well, I think there are specific problems and challenges in specific cities. So Leicester, as we know, a little while back, had some community tensions. I've commissioned some work into what the situation was in Leicester to see what's specific to Leicester and what are the broader lessons that we can learn. Because I think there are some questions about the schools that children go to, the homes that people are living in, you know, the way in which they're allocated by local authorities and so on, that do need to be addressed in order to make sure that we can have the greatest level of harmony. But there are some cities...
But this is your failure, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a collective...
You guys have been there for 13 years and things have gone backwards. It's your failure.
No, I don't think that at all, because I think that overall you can see that attitudes towards migration in this country have become warmer over time. If you compare our attitudes towards people coming from other countries,
Okay.
now and, say, 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay.
We are, in Europe, the country, I think, which shows the most welcoming attitudes towards people coming here.
Right.
And we're also the most successful. You need only look at our cabinet, our government and our parliament, as well as leadership of our, our country and civil society to see that.
Well, your Home Secretary has a slightly different view, but let's get to the thing that you want to talk about today. And I just want to ask you one question about this. You've created this fund for towns to spruce up the high streets and all of that.
Exactly.
But by my reckoning, it's an endowment fund.
Yes.
The 50 towns that you've named will get something like, essentially, £1 million a year out of this fund. That's going to refurbish a few shops. It's not very much, is it?
It's £20 million, and it's over 10 years, and it's a
Yeah,
partnership.
for 10 years over for 50 towns.
55 towns, but the key thing is that that money is there in partnership with those towns, and that money is joined by other initiatives. So, for example, we spent time already in Wednesbury, in the West Midlands, a place that we both know well, West Brom, that £20 million was allocated earlier this week to them. They're using it to revive the high street, to deal effectively with antisocial behaviour. And again, in each of those communities, that additional funding will help to deal with some of the challenges that those communities themselves have identified.
I'll let you give the example, but let's be realistic. That this £1 billion that you're trumpeting is less than the lottery gives out in a single year. And more importantly, the council leaders that you're going to meet, I guess, next week, will be telling you this. They will say that grant money to English councils fell in real terms by 21% between 2010 and 2022. This is basically putting a lipstick on a pig, isn't it?
No, certainly not. The sums that we're allocating today are on top of a larger than ever allocation of money to local government, which we secured in the spending review, and it's also on top of other projects that we're undertaking to level up. I mentioned earlier the strength of our Metro mayors. Our Metro mayor in Teesside, Ben Hatchen, has brought 4,000 high-paying jobs to Redcar. Redcar is one of the towns that's also benefiting today. Redcar's MP, Jacob Young, has managed to secure funding not only for his town centre, but also for research and development, skills and industry.
All right, that's good for the ad. But one last question, which comes from the viewers, which is this. You're known for lots of things, but the aphorism for which you're probably best known is the people of this country have had enough of experts. And I know you were talking about economists, but since that point, to take an example, COVID.
Yes.
Vaccine.
Yes.
Expert Kate Bingham. Would you like to, in any way, amend your assessment of the need for experts?
Well, I did at the time. It was our colleague Faisal Islam, here on Sky, who asked me that question.
I know.
And I said that we had enough of experts from organisations with acronyms that had got things wrong in the past. People, like the IFS and others. And the point I was making is that economic forecasting was invented... No, there was a specific... Economic forecasting was invented to make astrology look respectable. And my point is, specifically economic forecasting, I always think that you should be sceptical about that. But expertise in medicine, in history, expertise in physics, in chemistry, I absolutely revere.
So we've clarified here. Experts are good, unless they're economists, because they're idiots.
Economic forecasting. Economists can help in certain circumstances, but economic forecasting, I think, as I say, I'd rather trust Russell Grant than some economic forecasters.
Right, the London School of Economics, this is the man to talk to. Michael Gove, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That was the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove. I suspect that we're going to be getting quite a lot of email from my economist friends, and I'm waiting for Ed Conway to burst into the studio to explain why people who have his expertise are actually valuable. They're certainly valuable to us here at Sky. Now, let's get some immediate reaction to what the Levelling Up Secretary has been saying. And we've got something a bit different for you this week. is a conference special, and there is no one better to turn to than the stars of the brand new Sky News and Politico podcast. It is called Politics and Jack and Sam's, and that is our very own Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, and Politico's UK Editor, Jack Blanchard. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
So we're all going to be tuning in tonight. What can we expect?
Well, this podcast is going to be unlike the many other podcasts out there because what we're trying to do is give people a briefing on the week ahead. This isn't just me and Sam chatting, chewing the fat about stuff that happened last week or stuff in our heads. This is an essential briefing for people to really get a grip on what's coming up in the next few days in Westminster politics.
So, Sam, we're not going to get another centrist dad chat between... I mean, well, you know, there's plenty of that around, isn't there?
It's a bit, maybe.
Well, we're both dads, but apart from that... look, I think that the point of the podcast is that we'll have read the papers, watched the interviews, spoken to the advisors and the people that know, gone through the diaries, and we're trying to do the discussion that you can get elsewhere in a week's time, a week ahead, because a lot of people want to know what's coming up and why they should care about stuff, and so that's the point of the podcast.
And the idea as well is that, you know, maybe people have got better things to do at the weekend than, you know, spend all Saturday and Sunday reading the papers and thinking about politics. Maybe they want to walk the dog or go to the pub. But if they come back on a Sunday evening, we will tell them everything they need to know about the week ahead.
What are you trying to say, Jack? I mean, you know, everybody's watching now, and they're going to be, and they're now going to be discussing. They're now going for the rest of the morning. They're going to be discussing the things that you and I are now going to talk about. Now, Michael Gove said something interesting, I think, here. He wants to cut taxes on work. And what was quite interesting is that I think he said he wants to get it done in the next year. Is that new?
That sounded very much to me like Michael Gove lobbying the Prime Minister and lobbying the Chancellor for his view on where tax changes need to come. I think we heard something quite interesting from him there. We've heard a lot of kite flying about inheritance tax cuts. A lot of discussion about that over the last week. Michael Gove pretty clear that that's not where he thinks the focus should be, but it should be on something like income tax or something like national insurance, and he's come out and said it this morning.
Do you think he got a chance, Sam?
Well, look, it's interesting. What he's doing, it felt to me, is it's harking back to that election campaign in 2015, where the Conservatives quite successfully put themselves on the side of working people, focusing some of their tax breaks, tax cuts at lower paid people in work. And I think that there's a potential for a political opportunity to go back to that kind of campaign theme. But we're quite late on in the Parliament. We're quite late on in this whole cycle. I thought it was significant that he said that he wants to lower the tax burden in this Parliament. That means that they need to start doing stuff now, and they haven't got much time. Also, I think if you look at it slightly longer term, one of the things coming down the tracks is real spending squeezes after the election. So they might be able to promise to cut taxes now, but then immediately, whoever gets elected, there's a big problem there. You either squeeze public services or you increase taxes at that point. So are these promises for the long term?
Well, I think that the whole long-term thing is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? I mean, on HS2, that was a long-term project, but we don't seem to be getting very far with getting an answer with what's actually going to happen.
I think, you know, the Conservative Party are claiming that they're here to talk about long-term decisions. There's big banners all around this conference centre, Trevor, as you've seen, saying long-term decisions. That's the sort of message they want to get across. The truth is, no one in the Conservative Party is thinking beyond the next election. That all they care about is desperately trying to claw back this extraordinary poll lead that Labour have. And so all the messaging you're hearing and all the policies you're going to hear are solely about that. But I think the tax thing is interesting because it is an internal conversation happening right now within the Conservative Party. So for Michael Gove to throw his weight into that, he's obviously a big figure and a big voice.
And I think that, I mean, we'll hear what the Prime Minister has to say on Wednesday. I guess he won't be saying anything before that. But you've watched him for a long time, Sam. Is he, do you think, more inclined to the Gove point of view? We've heard it this morning, which is get it done, start the tax cutting now, or what I think I read from Jeremy Hunt, which is I'm not going to go there unless and until I've actually got lots of headroom.
Look, Rishi Sunak needs to have a USP. He needs to have a thing to sell himself to the British electorate with. And the closest that we've seen so far, and I think he wants to revive this, is somebody who won't say the things that the party wants to hear, but will take difficult decisions. That's what he did during the leadership contest with Liz Truss. Sadly for him, he lost. But now I think he's going to revive that theme and try and talk about how he's looked at he spent a year looking at how government works, found what he thinks doesn't, and will be honest about that. That's the sort of the bigger theme. I don't think he feels the need to splurge now, but there is enormous pressure from all around the Conservative Party to do something. I think one of the things that I'm looking at the closest this week is whether or not the messaging from him and his close allies is more aimed at the country or more aimed at slightly trying to take the temperature out of the row inside the Conservative Party. Because there's no doubt, whether it's tax, whether it's HS2, whether it's a whole range of things, migration, there is either a conversation outward-facing or a conversation inward-facing. Which does he choose to have?
Well, you've mentioned migration, and of course that's been a big theme this week, which it's not quite clear how it's all going to shake out, but Suella Braverman essentially put the cat amongst the pigeons on that one. Do you think this is an internal party issue, or is it one that is going to cut through to the country?
Well, I think the Conservatives want to make it one of their big dividing line issues for the next election. They are looking at ways to differentiate themselves from a Labour Party that is way ahead in the polls. And, of course, in Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, they're not millions of miles apart in the type of people that they are. They're both sort of quite technocratic, some might say a little bit boring sort of leaders. And so they're looking to set up big ways to differentiate themselves from Labour, where they think that the Tories can get on the right side of public opinion. And they certainly think migration is one of those issues, and illegal immigration particularly, and therefore they will put it front and centre of what they're doing. You know, we will see these big announcements made on it. Maybe not this week, maybe they're going to wait until after the Supreme Court case that's coming on their Rwanda policy before they do it, but there's no doubt they're going to want to spend a lot of the election campaign.
Is it smart politics, do you think, to have that high on the agenda this week? Because it feels like could appeal to some people, but it also could suggest division in the party.
I mean, there's only so much smart politics you can do with the migration stuff when we're coming down the track is probably the news that net migration has topped 1 million people. So you can have all the politics, you know, all the smart announcements, all the dividing lines that you want, but reality does kind of come crashing like a meteorite down to the surface of the earth, and allow Labour to say, look, this isn't a question of ever ratcheting up the sort of pressure, but, you know, it's a question of actual failure. Look, there's a big problem here, which is so many people in the Conservative Party want to leave the European Convention on Human Rights in order to, and for many reasons, but in order to get off the hook with some of the commitments with migration. But I'm not sure Rishi Sunak really wants to do that. That would undermine his deal over Northern Ireland, the Windsor Framework. It's not his first choice of where he wants to go with it, but he might be dragged there, potentially, for internal party reasons by the campaign.
We will return to this a little later in the show. I'll talk to you more in a few minutes. Now, if you want a quick taste of Jack and Sam's first podcast, or just want to follow the feed now so you're ready for that first episode later today, then you can scan the QR code on the screen now. It's on your podcast app and also on the Sky News app. It is just after 9 o'clock, I see. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, told this programme that he wants to see the tax burden reduced before the next election, with tax cuts focused on work. In a moment, we'll be joined by the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel. There's a big by-election in Scotland on Thursday. Labour hopes it can take a seat from the SNP and line themselves up for more wins north of the border. A little later, I'll speak to the Shadow Scotland Secretary, Ian Murray. And it was pretty difficult to get to conference here in Manchester yesterday because of an ASLEF train drivers' strike. So I'll be speaking sternly to the General Secretary, Mick Whelan. Now, much of this week was dominated by a row about a speech given by the Home Secretary in the United States about immigration and multiculturalism in this country. Suella Braverman said being gay or a woman and fearing discrimination for either was not a legitimate basis for seeking asylum in this country. She questioned multiculturalism in the United Kingdom and the United Nations Refugee Convention. Well, it caused anger amongst many on the left and delighted plenty on the right. Her immediate predecessor at the Home Office was Priti Patel, who will be speaking alongside former Prime Minister Liz Truss tomorrow at an event dubbed the Great Growth Rally. And she will be speaking to me now.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're going to come to the Suella's speech in a moment, but let's just talk about what's going to happen at this conference. Is it correct that you are amongst those who are going to refuse to vote for any government that does not reduce taxes?
Well, so it's not just any government, it's actually policies that will increase taxes. That's really important. And I see you've just had a conversation with my former colleague, my cabinet colleague, Michael Gove, about this. And tax is important as an issue. This is our last conference before a general election. And quite frankly, it's one of those issues that also differentiates us between the Labour Party. We're pro-enterprise, pro-economic growth, pro-letting hard-working people keep more of their money. So I'll be speaking at the Growth Rally tomorrow. I'm actually speaking at other forums as well, where I will absolutely be saying that we must stand up for conservative values and beliefs. This is the time to do it. And also, Trevor, you'll know this. I mean, look at where we're sitting right now. This hall is full of, you know, lots of stands, exhibitions, but party conference has always been about our members, party members that go out in a general election campaign, want to talk about conservative values and beliefs and do all the hard work.
Well, let's talk about what that means concretely. Are you with Michael Gove in his suggestion that you need to bring down taxes before the next election, and that the taxes you need to target are taxes on work? I'm thinking national insurance. I am thinking income tax.
Well, employment, absolutely, in the sense that at the end of the day, Trevor, people must be able to feel better off under the Conservatives. And that means they've got to have more money in their pockets. And we're speaking right now at a time when clearly inflation is a very significant problem, but also there's a cost of living issue in the country as well. So things are tight, you know, times are difficult. Right. And we have to be champions of hard-working people across the country that, quite frankly, are finding life difficult right now. Look at, you know, actually, to be fair...
Let's just get concrete about... When he says, let's talk about taxes on work. Do you want income tax down before you go to the country in a year's time?
Of course I'd like to see taxes come down, income tax in particular. We've got to be realistic about this, though, Trevor, as well. I mean, here we are in October. There'll be a fiscal cycle that comes up. I think Michael Gove mentioned this as well. Obviously, this is all decisions for the Chancellor. The Chancellor himself, Jeremy Hunt, has already spoken and said that he would like to see taxes come down, but obviously that is for him. Now, you know a fiscal cycle as well as I do.
But he says it in a way that says, actually, it's not going to happen unless if there's a choice to be made, it won't be in favour of tax cuts.
Trevor, let's be realistic as well. The other point to make, it is now October. There'll be fiscal events that come up. The public, for them to feel an absolute tangible change and difference, we've got to work on this sooner. And I think what is quite interesting around conference, and you'll see this over the next few days, many of my colleagues feel exactly the same. That's the differentiation between us and Labour. We believe in supporting enterprise, supporting hard work, empowering people. And of course, it's inevitable these discussions are going to come up at party conference.
We believe in supporting hard work. One way in which people think about supporting hard work is being able to store up their wealth and pass it on to their children.
Yes.
Where are you on inheritance tax?
Well, I think it needs reforming. Quite frankly, I'd rather see it go. And I've said that many, many times.
So would you like the Chancellor in whichever fiscal event chooses
the answer is yes, I would.
Goodbye to inheritance tax.
I would. It is a regressive and a punitive tax. And I see this, actually, as a Member of Parliament, and I'm sure you've met many individuals over a number of years. You see that we believe in supporting people, buying assets, owning their home, a property-owning democracy, all these core values. And then when they see the amount of tax they then have to pay on it, or how difficult it is to leave behind their hard-earned assets to their family, I think it's right that we stand up for them.
So...
That is not a walk in the park, though, Trevor, honestly. I mean, these are difficult areas of taxation, and I would like to see that work on reform start sooner rather than later.
Well, this is very interesting, because what you already told me, let's cut some taxes on work, income tax. Let's get rid of inheritance tax. There is a reason why the tax burden has climbed to nearly 38%. If you get rid of these taxes, something is going to have to go. So what are you going to cut in terms of public spending to pay for those tax cuts?
And that's right. Choices will have to be made. Let's not forget the size of the state has exponentially grown. I'm sure you looked at that IFS report that came out on Friday, which clearly stated we have a 70-year high tax burden. The size of the state, the amount of GDP that is going on the state is actually outstripping our economic growth.
But we're talking, when you say the size of the state, let's not make this abstract. What we're talking about is pensions. We're talking about health. We're talking about education. OK, there's three.
We're not just talking about...
Which of those is going to go?
You're wrong. We're not just speaking about those three, not just on specifics, but more broadly. If you look at the size of the state, that actually means unelected decision-making bodies, for example. Look at projects that are being, you know, where
like
the costs of them...
HS2?
HS2 is a very good example. Why is it that HS2, the costs are going up and up and up, when actually the cost of HS1 was delivered not just on time but under budget?
Well, you just asked a question. I'm looking for an answer. What is going to pay for these tax cuts? Let me give you let's test them out. Get rid of HS2. You don't want to complete it.
Well, I'm not saying that at all. I think we need supply-side reforms and more infrastructure investment. The reality is, Trev, look, when you look, I've worked in Whitehall.
You can't have it both ways. You cannot have both. You constantly attack Labour on this grounds. You can't have it both ways. You can't have tax cuts and then also
yes, we can.
the same level of spending.
But we can. And it has been done in the past before. Even if you go back to the 1980s when there was high inflation and high unemployment, it was the policies of supply-side economic reform that brought inflation down, created jobs in our country and created economic growth that ranged from 3%, 4% and 5% over a decade. So it is possible. And that does mean, yes, hard choices. And actually, the one thing I would say, Trevor, to you is, all credit to Rishi Sunak, he's speaking about long-term decisions and making hard choices. These are the type of hard choices that have to be made in the long run to give us the type of economic security that the British people want to see.
Let me put it as gently as I can. There will be intelligent people out there watching this interview, and what they will be saying is, I think I've heard this message before, and I think I've heard it from somebody called Liz Truss. You can have tax cuts, you can reduce the levels of income tax, but you can also have all that you want on public spending. You can have as much health care as you want. You can have all the education, and actually it'll be fantastic.
Actually, I'm not sure. I wasn't in Liz Truss's government, so I'm not going to boil it down.
I was listening to it.
That's very,
and so was the rest of the country.
That's very good, but I'm also saying that we have in the past, I've given you a very good example in the 1980s of high rates of inflation, high rates of unemployment, supply-side reforms that actually brought around the economic change that we need. And the reality is right now, Trevor, I mean, I'm sure you've read that report on Friday from the IFS.
I have.
The size of the state. By the way, it isn't just about health and education. I think the Conservative Party should be very proud of the fact that we have something now like 41,000 more nurses in the NHS. You know, we don't hear people speaking about that very often. The whole issue around schools and education, the way in which standards have been increased, that is down to good long-term investment. But on top of that, there is a hell of a lot of waste that goes on in government. And I'm sure if you speak to every single minister, and you'll have many on your programme in the weeks to come, they could give you examples. I'll give you one example now. Last year, I gave the police a pay increase, and I did that from the Home Office budget. So there are ways in which these outcomes can be achieved.
We could have a seminar about the difference between early 1980s and now. But I want to talk to you about something which I think you're better qualified than most to discuss. Suella Braverman said in Washington last week that multiculturalism had failed. In what way was that helpful to Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think you'll have to ask her and ask Rishi Sunak, to be honest. I mean, she's given a speech, and I think, actually, I did hear what your political reporter said earlier on, Sam Coates. To me, this is very much, you know, making interventions, statements. But actually, Trevor, I think we have to be realistic here, that those are that's not a substitute for delivery around, you know, changes to policy in government. Now, I don't know what the intention was around that. It might just be to get attention, to have the dividing lines that, you know, your previous commentators were mentioning as we go into a run-up to a general election. Now, I can understand that. I can absolutely understand that. But you and I sitting here today, OK, we are the products of actual integration, multiculturalism, dynamic communities, people that love our country, want to contribute to our country, along with a hell of a lot of other people that have done exactly the same. And I think that's something we should be proud of in our country.
I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing is, before you sound off on the theoretical and cultural issues, wouldn't it be a good idea if you stopped some boats and brought down the numbers of immigration? Would that be a completely unfair interpretation?
Well, you are trying to put words into my mouth, Trevor, and that's all well and good. The government has made, I think actually even in this hall, we've seen a stop the boats message. The government has been clear. Rishi Sunak, his Home Secretary, have been clear that that is their priority. This side of a general election, if I may politely suggest, it is about delivery, and the government will be judged on delivery. When you make pledges, statements and promises, you have to deliver. But of course, pledges are no substitute for action. And I think the public, they're sick about hearing about some of these issues and the failure to deliver. And I think it's right that everyone puts shoulder to the wheel and cracks on and does the work.
Would a little silence from Suella be welcome?
Look, Home Secretaries of the day rightly should be speaking about a range of issues in their portfolio. But I have to say, and I say this for everyone actually, and you know, I saw Michael Gove earlier on the programme as well. I've been in that job. Being Home Secretary is a very difficult job. It's multifaceted in many ways. You are juggling many difficult issues, ranging from the security of our country to support for our brilliant police. You know, I think the public want delivery now. They really do.
All right, look, I mean, I take what you said a moment ago. You know, as you say, here you are, a daughter of Ugandan refugees. You went through comprehensive school. You're now a dame, and you've been Home Secretary. All of that, you know. And you rightly point out, I've got a sort of shadowy, small version of that in my own life.
Very successful, Trevor.
But let me put to you what I think might be in the current Home Secretary's mind. I put it to Michael Gove earlier on that the Bradford Council had produced this report showing that the chances of interaction between Asian people in Bradford and the majority population had actually declined over the last decade. Now, isn't it reasonable for her to sound the alarm about something like that?
I've got no issue with that at all, but put some perspective and context around it. I think that's very important. You know, if there'd been an example of Bradford, for example, and perhaps even Leicester last year. I remember what happened in Leicester.
Where there was a conflict between
that's right.
Hindu people in Bradford and Muslim people in Bradford.
But what I would say, because I know the community reasonably well up there as well, and there are some other wider issues around employment, social issues. People, they want to work. People want to work and they want to contribute and integrate. So I think context matters a great deal. And I've seen programmes around the country, I've sat with councils around the country where it's pretty obvious that there are communities that have not integrated. We don't want that. That is not right. And I think it is important to give voice to that. But you cannot generalise, and I think context is important. And then just to add to that point as well, you know, I think we're here in Manchester. One of the most successful resettled communities in Manchester are actually, particularly in recent years, are the Hong Kongers, the BNOs that have come over. You know, they're educated, highly articulate, they are contributing. I've visited some, you know, I've met many in my tenure as Home Secretary. We cannot ultimately say that, you know, across the board, people are not...
But there are different ways in which people do this. I mean, one of the things that I remember from the days when I was close to this kind of issue was that here in Manchester, an interesting thing is that some communities cluster, but that Chinese community is distributed across the city. I think that the story was that there were no more than 6 Chinese children in any school. So there are different ways, and government can make it easier for people to do it, as it were, the Chinese way.
I think
than
yes,
other ways.
Trevor. You may appreciate the point that I'm about to make is that historically that has been much harder. 1960s, 1970s, for example, when communities that were new to the United Kingdom did not have support structures around them. So naturally they came together and lived in that way. Now it is very different. And the other point to make is that a lot of local councils do a lot more in integration. I mean, I saw this with Syrian refugees, BNOs, the Ukraine scheme. You know, integration is paramount. So I think it's important to give voice to these issues. Of course it is. But again, always have the right kind of context around this.
Just very quickly, something that surprised me that I heard that you had said, which is that you said that an article which had called Britain lawless, and you described that article as spot on. Do you really believe that?
No, not in the sense of Britain being lawless. There are very legitimate issues, and I know the article you're referring to, around knife crime. We saw that senseless murder of that young 15-year-old girl last week, and that's just appalling and tragic and totally preventable. Now, there is something there around, and to be fair, I did a lot of work, Trevor, on knife crime, gang work, county lines, getting weapons off the streets, stop and search. These are important areas, and I think there is more that needs to be done there. Young people are losing their lives senselessly, and I'm sure that all parents and families, and, you know, God bless that poor girl last week and her family, they are going through a terribly tragic and traumatic time, and that could have been preventable.
You can give me a quick yes or no to this. You're on platform with Liz Truss tomorrow. Could she come back as leader of the party?
No.
Thank you. Let's turn back now to our panel. It's unusual to get a one-word answer. I'm really surprised. Thank you very much, Priti Patel. Let's turn back to our panel to get some immediate reaction to our interview with the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel. And getting into the seats now are our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, and his podcast mate, the Politico's UK editor, Jack Blanchard. And both of them will be in our new podcast, Politics at Jack and Sam's tonight, which you will be able to see. Well, she took me by surprise by actually answering a question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to recover from that. What do you think, Sam?
I think that's right. I don't think Liz Truss is coming back as Prime Minister. There was a little flurry around in one media outlet yesterday. The big story of that interview is just how much she doesn't like Suella Braverman. I mean, gosh, I enjoyed the shade. I'm going to read you back a couple of quotes. Talking about that big speech in America last week by the Home Secretary where she talked about hinted maybe pulling out of the European Convention of Human Rights. I don't know what the intention was around that. It might just be to get attention. Now, at that point, I'm going to let you into a secret. I probably shouldn't do this. But just standing off set...
Between us, right?
Just off set was her aide. And I went like that, and he went... So I don't think this is an accident.
Was he running away?
No, he was smiling and laughing. He was loving it.
Wow.
And then that bit towards the end of the interview, you and I are sitting here today. We are the product of integration, multiculturalism. I think that's something we should be proud of. Again, very different to Suella Braverman last week. Look, there are lots of people fighting at this conference, but the bit where it feels like it might get quite personal is between those people who themselves have some hope of doing well in the future. That actually might be the bitterest bit of this week.
Can I just say, Trevor, Tory conference is off to a flyer. It's only been going for less than an hour. You've already had Michael Gove on here lobbying for tax cuts before the election in areas we're not sure the Chancellor's too happy about. You've had the former Home Secretary coming on and slagging off the current Home Secretary. What happens in the next half an hour?
Well, it's only because you two are here. They're obviously performing for you. I must say, I was a little bit surprised that she was so direct about Suella Braverman. I mean, Braverman has become this very divisive figure, and presumably this is all about fighting for, in the event that they don't win the next election, fighting for the next leadership and staking out a position on what people call the Writers' Party. Of course, we've also seen in the papers today a big interview from the other candidate at that end, Kemi Badenoch. How's this going to resolve itself?
When you say Suella Braverman's become a divisive figure, she has made herself a divisive figure. She wants to be that divisive figure. She wants to bait people on the left, bait people she sees as liberals to come at her because she thinks that gives her more support, and she's probably right, among the base of the Conservative Party. And don't forget, If the Conservatives do lose the next election, which polls suggest is still likely, although far from certain, Rishi Sunak will be out on his ear, and it will be those Tory grassroots members, the same people that chose Liz Truss last time they got a chance, who will be selecting the next Tory leader. So she is 100% messaging for those people, trying to position herself as the person that they would pick if the election is lost.
Does this kind of ruckus harm their electoral chances?
I think the fact that there's the impression of division is probably the biggest problem here. Look, Rishi Sunak needs to use this conference to represent himself to the British public. But on the front pages, there's a cacophony of different competing voices, different messages, and bluntly kind of conflict with him. Now, I wouldn't have predicted that Tory conference started with the Home Secretary having a full-on pop at, checks notes, Elton John. Right, that was not the way I predicted this conference. And if I was in the political forecasting business, I would mark that down as a failure for failing to see that coming. But there is just this problem for Rishi Sunak, that the more these other voices drown out what he wants to say, the less the public hear the very clear and precise message that he has.
And I think there's another problem as well, which is, you know, at this stage in the election cycle, coming into an election now, probably less than a year away, maybe about a year away, you know, you need your cabinet pulling together at least and being big voices in support. The problem is when someone like Kemi Badenoch comes out and speaks, it looks like a leadership bid.
Yeah.
When Suella Braverman makes a big speech, it looks like a leadership bid. It doesn't look like the unity message, as Sam says, they urgently need.
Well, if the Prime Minister wants to calm the waters, we've still got some time. He can come on anytime he likes. Anyway, coming up, I'm going to speak to the Shadows Scotland Secretary, Ian Murray, with the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election just days away.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election is just 4 days away. Labour are targeting winning the seat from the SNP as a sign that they're making progress in Scotland, and they're making hay from the ruling party's woes over the last year. Given those problems, not least the arrest of the former leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, Labour is the overwhelming favourite to win what is a crucial test of whether Keir Starmer can form a majority government at Westminster in the next general election. Now, I can speak to the Shadow Scotland Secretary, Ian Murray. Good morning, Mr Murray. There's a by-election, this by-election in Rutherglen, and you used to hold the seat. SNP won it in 2019. Since then, the MPs had to stand down for breaking COVID rules. The SNP's under investigation over its financing. 110,000 camper van suddenly appeared from nowhere. Their new leaders identified with a poor health service and an unpopular policy on gender reassignment. How is it possible that the SNP is still neck and neck with you in Scotland?
Well, we've made tremendous progress and we're taking nothing for granted in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. We've knocked on 80,000 doors, we've spoken to 30,000 people, delivered hundreds of thousands of leaflets and been listening very clearly to what those voters have been telling to the Labour Party. And what they're saying is they're very concerned about the cost of living crisis, they're very concerned about the direction of both governments, 13 years of failure at Westminster from the Conservatives and 16 years of failure from the SNP in Scotland, and they are desperate for change, and our candidate Michael Shanks in Rutherglen and Hamilton West provides the opportunity for that fresh start. Don't forget, when Anas Sarwar became leader of the Scottish Labour Party and Keir Starmer at the UK Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party were polling 14%. Now that we're neck and neck and on the up against the SNP, we're looking forward to the general election that can't come soon enough.
Yeah, you're telling me, I'm sure correctly, how hard you're working, but that in a way rather emphasises the point. You're working hard, the SNP is imploding, but still you can't get clear of them. Why won't Scots warm to Labour, given that this was a Labour country? Used to return 45, 50 members of Parliament in the old days.
Well, the latest projections, as you're talking about the polls, and they are only polls, have us neck and neck with the SNP, but indeed the extrapolation of the seat numbers from that would probably have us ahead. We're taking absolutely nothing for granted, which is why we're working very hard, because we have to earn the right of every single voter to put the cross in the Labour box, and that's what we're demonstrating in Rutherglen and Hamilton West on Thursday. I mean, Keir Starmer's been very, very clear that the route to the Labour government, the next Labour government, runs through Scotland. He's very clear it's a priority for him, and we're working very, very hard, both in policy terms, but indeed holding our governments to account in terms of providing that support to local people, providing that voice and providing that alternative. Change is coming to Scotland, everyone knows that, and we're working very, very hard to ensure that we can get our positive message across on the doorsteps to the voters, so that we can make sure that we can win the next general election and kick out this Conservative government.
One change that isn't coming to Scotland is that 45% of the people, or thereabouts, still want independence, and slightly larger percentage think that there ought to be a referendum. Your party leader, unless you're going to tell me different, has been very clear. There will be no referendum, there will be no independence for Scotland. And isn't that your problem? That until you shift on that, that 45% or thereabouts are never going to come back to Labour.
But that's just not what we're seeing in the polls. The priority of the Scottish people at the moment has nothing to do with the Constitution, and of course the question will continue to be polled, but it's gone so far down the list of priorities it's nearly fallen off the end, because people are worried about the cost of living crisis, they're worried about their energy costs, they're worried about the fact that 1 in 7 are on NHS waiting lists in Scotland, they're worried about the future, and they have a concerted effort to want to kick out this Conservative government at Westminster, and they're very concerned about the 16 years of failure from this SNP government. So they're continually turning to Labour to see what we've got to say, and we want to put forward that positive policy platform that would take us into the next election. That's what they're telling us on the doorsteps. That's what we're doing when we're listening to people in all four corners of Scotland, and that's what we want to try and deliver. The Constitution is a low priority, but you are correct to say that our position is no to independence and no to a second independence referendum, because if we have the privilege of being in power after the next general election at UK level, we'll want to deliver our manifesto and we'll want to deliver the missions that Keir has set out.
Yeah, but the point that some of your colleagues make is that as long as you still have the wrong position, I put that in inverted commas, on this question of independence and on the referendum, the people who are going to take a look at Labour, as you say, will take a look at Labour, but they will still choose to vote for the SNP. And, you know, Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, is going to have to do something extreme, you know, slaughter the firstborn, ban iron brew or something, in order to detach those people from the SNP.
Well, the First Minister is doing his very best to have people detaching themselves from the SNP with his failure on public services, his failure in government. And if you look at everything over the last 16 years in Scotland and 13 years across the UK, people are worse off and things are getting worse. So they are failing governments, and we're providing that positive alternative. That change, everyone knows that next election's got to be about change. Everyone knows that only a vote for the Labour Party can kick the Conservatives out of Downing Street. And everybody knows we've got a very positive agenda, and the voters of Rutherglen and Hamilton West are responding to that, and we'll see the result as we come into early part of Friday morning of next week.
OK, I want to ask you about HS2, but I just want to check one thing. Labour says it won't sign off on new oil exploration licences in the North Sea. Offshore Energy UK says that the industry supports 200,000 jobs, including 90,000 in Scotland. Is Labour telling Scots that it won't sign off on oil exploration licences so they can start looking for jobs elsewhere?
Well, what we want to try and do is deliver the fifth mission that Keir laid out at the tail end of last year, which is to turn the UK into a green superpower. We're losing the global race on this, and we have all the renewable facilities and all the opportunity to be able to deliver that green superpower by decarbonising our energy by 2030. That creates the 50,000 jobs in Scotland. We will have GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company headquartered in Scotland, creating jobs, and all the jobs that are currently in the North Sea will be around for a long time to come, but we'll be creating new and additional jobs in the renewable sector, which is what the skills we're looking for. There's a huge and exciting and bold and ambitious agenda, and we should all be getting right behind it.
All right, before I let you go, can you just help me solve a puzzle? The Mayor of Manchester, Labour Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, said on this programme last week that Labour is committed to bringing HS2 from central London to Manchester. Yet, for the past 2 weeks, on several Sky programmes, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Pat McFadden have all refused to make that commitment. Should I add you to the list of those who are sitting on the fence, or are you with Andy Burnham? It's going to happen.
Well, it's quite clear we want the HS2 line delivered. It doesn't go into London at the moment, and it doesn't go into the north. You had your levelling up secretary on the programme earlier, who should be called the dumbing down secretary. He's letting down the north. But if the government blow a hole in the HS2 programme, we're going to have to assess what it's like at the next election. That's a perfectly sensible thing to do. We want it to happen. We want the line to be completed. That's the right thing to do for the north of England. But in actual fact, we can't really commit, given what the government won't tell us the numbers. They won't give us a commitment to whether or not they will deliver it, and at this moment in time we wouldn't know at the next election what that hole in that HS2 project would look like.
So that's a pretty clear answer. We can't tell you.
Well, we can't tell you because the government can't tell us, and until they tell us, we can't do an assessment of where we will be. You've just had the You've just had many government members on your programme this morning who can't commit to anything at this stage, and they're all fighting with each other in terms of leadership candidates for the next leader of the Conservative Party.
All right. Ian Murray, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Coming up, it was a battle to get up here yesterday with train drivers on strike, and there are more walkouts to come. We'll speak to the boss of the ASLEF Train Drivers Union.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. And as you can see, they've winkled us out of our Westminster studio, and we are here at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. Now, usually we'd head to a conference like this on the train, but that was not possible yesterday because of strikes. ASLEF members walked out on Saturday, and they are going to do so again in a few days' time. The whole month will be affected by a mix of strikes and overtime bans. That means relations between the Conservatives and the rail unions are going to be even more sour than usual, if you can imagine that. And that begs the question, will these rail strikes ever end? Well, man to ask is ASLEF General Secretary Mick Whelan, who joins me now. Mr. Whelan, let me just start with a question about, if you like, the mood of the country. And I'm not only asking this because I had to sit in the car for 5 hours yesterday and my leg is still killing me, but the average wage for your members is above £50,000. Do you really expect people to sympathise?
Well, strangely enough, we didn't privatise the industry. Strangely enough, the people that we actually work for aren't the government. The people that we work for are the Trentalias and the Advantes and those privateers that have been in our industry for the last 2.5 decades, who are all making hundreds of millions of pounds in profits, who are all making dividends payments to their shareholders, but aren't paying their workers. And when you get to the best part of half a decade without a pay rise, I think we've got a right to ask.
Oh, so this strike is not really entirely about the money. It is also about the structure of the rail industry.
Well, yes. I mean, we've frightening changing world in a post-pandemic world. But let's put this into context. I don't have a problem in Scotland. I don't have a problem in Wales. I don't have a problem in freight. I don't have a problem in Eurostar, Elizabeth Line, Open Access. We've done 14 pay deals in the last 12 months. I have a Westminster problem where the employers have signed a rather corrupt deal with the government not to give us a pay rise.
When you say corrupt, that's quite a big charge. What is corrupt about the deal?
Well, what we have is actually all these companies, we've got free collective bargaining. We've got bargaining arrangements that are vastly different than all these companies that we've legally agreed with them. And the companies quite happily signed away those arrangements without any discussion to us to keep their snouts in the trough. And now we've got companies who bear no revenue risk, have no penalties for not running trains or cancelled trains, who are making more money than they ever made before, but at the behest of the government, not paying the train drivers.
Steady. I think we just need to get clear about this. These are companies that are operating perfectly legally. They can pay their executives whatever their shareholders think is right, and they are engaged in old-fashioned collective bargaining with you. What is corrupt about that?
No, they're not. We'd be bargaining in each and every company separately because of the privatised nature and fractionalised nature of our industry. What they did was sign up collectively with the government to obviate that process. Now, that was deceitful. We've operated in good faith. My members went to work during the pandemic, right, to get other key workers and move food and medicine around the country. We didn't seek a pay rise during that period of time. And like every other worker in the country, when we got to the year after the pandemic and lockdown was over and inflation started going through the roof, we started trying to negotiate through the normal processes to find out that they signed this deal that they hadn't told us about. And we were going told to go and talk to the government. When we went to talk to the government, they told us to go and talk to the employers. They don't talk to us. That inevitably led to strife. We didn't create this.
Is the reality here that actually what you object to is the privatisation of some parts of rail operating system, and that what you really want is for the whole system to be taken back into public ownership and subsidised by the taxpayer? That's not a dishonourable thing, but is that what you're really after here?
No, we've always wanted nationalisation, but we've worked within the system that's there. We didn't create it. And the fact of this is that whatever system you have, the railways aren't subsidised. The cost of running the railways is the cost of running the railways. Now, the more effectively you can run the railways, the better you can run the railways. That's great. It's been quite clear that all the tenets of privatisation, whether it be about outward investment, haven't happened, about reducing fares haven't happened, about creating innovation hasn't happened. The only people that have actually worked throughout all this, the workers in the industry, who've given the flexibility at every stage to deliver all the projects and all the things that they wanted to do. And we are now being hurt for it.
All right, it would be silly if I didn't ask just a yes or no answer on this. HS2, Birmingham to Manchester, going to happen or not?
Yes.
You heard it here from Mick Whelan. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Whelan.
Thank you.
In just a moment, we'll hear once again from Jack Blanchard and Sam Coates.
Andean bear, also called spectacled bear, because they have these sort of beautiful blonde markings on the face, which can look like spectacles. And they come from the Andes, as you've mentioned. So they range down from Venezuela, down through Ecuador, Colombia, following the Andean range right down to Bolivia. But there are only 10,000 left. So we were very fortunate to receive a male just a few months ago. He came to us as part of a love swap, really. So we exchanged a male. We had a male here who went to a zoo out on the south coast. That zoo sent a male up to us, Oberon, to be paired with our female Patcher. And it's quite a sort of tightly coordinated operation, because both zoos had to exchange animals at the same time. They had to leave at the same time, past each other somewhere along the M1. And he's here now and paired with Patcher, and we're awaiting the pitter-patter of tiny bare feet at some point in the future. Like a lot of species these days, unfortunately, they're where sort of human populations and communities are expanding. We're sort of coming into sharing areas, wild areas, with wild animals, and this is the case for the Andean bear. So there's a lot of farming that goes on throughout the Andean bear's range, cattle ranching as well. And inevitably, these animals in the wild would eat a sort of variety of vegetables, cactus, flowers, bromeliads, things like that. But if they come across a cornfield, that's an absolute bonanza. They'll have a field day, literally. Likewise, the males especially, they're quite large. They can take mainly sick cattle. So obviously, if you're a farmer, that's not great for you. So there's inevitable conflict between sort of bears and local communities. But we do work with our partners out in Bolivia, where we're sort of looking really to mitigate these threats through sort of education, and also trying to provide sort of alternative livelihoods, alternative sources of income for these communities, so that wildlife conflict doesn't occur.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Are you still the kingmaker of this Republican Party?
I've interviewed some of America's most recognisable politicians and celebrities too.
Always.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Now, let's go back to our panel. Sam Coates and Jack Blanchard are still with me. Now, gentlemen, Rishi Sunak got up on his hind legs on Wednesday, and he has to inspire, send a message, turn it all around. What's going to happen?
Easy, eh? When you put it like that. I mean, Rishi Sunak is not a naturally super inspiring speaker. I don't think he'll be remembered as one of the great orators of the age. So I would say he's got an uphill struggle to do that. But I think what we'll see is the next step in the staging post of what Downing Street have been trying to do since the summer came to an end, which is set out the dividing lines we were talking about earlier and really try and take the fight to Labour in a much more aggressive way than we've seen from Rishi Sunak over the previous years. So I think he'll go after Labour on these big issues where he thinks he can get the Tories on the right side of public opinion: migration, motoring, net zero, one or two others.
There was a very clear plan for this year, and it was to try to deliver on these 5 pledges. Notice how we really haven't been hearing a lot about those in the media and the interviews around the conference centre.
Nobody said 5 pledges.
Because they're not going the right way. The plan was to try and get the 5 pledges, try and meet them, and then you set out a whole load of promises to put in your manifesto for the next election. And it is kind of interesting just how how that's been slightly knocked off course by the pledges not, by them really struggling with the pledges. And the argument that they've got is a very clear one in their heads, but my question is whether they can deliver it. What they want to be able to say is that you might think that your life will change by voting for a different party, but actually, having looked under the bonnet of government, having worked out what's wrong and having a clear plan of what needs to happen next, Rishi Sunak is the one that can improve your lives in a practical sense, because that's what he's doing with the other things. But that plan in the first stage hasn't quite worked. So it's much harder for Rishi Sunak right now to use this moment, I think, to make an argument that this and this promise for the manifesto will be delivered.
Thursday, the caravan will move on to Liverpool and Labour. And Keir Starmer's got his job to do because, though they're ahead in the polls, all the wise people say that though Labour is ahead, Keir Starmer hasn't totally endeared himself to the electorate. What's he got to do?
Well, I think what the first thing Keir Starmer will be hoping for is some rocket boosters for the start of Labour conference from the Rutherglen by-election that you were just talking about earlier. If Scottish Labour can show that they can win in Scotland again, that is against the SNP, that is a big moment for Keir Starmer and a real help in terms of the electoral map that he is trying to redraw next year. So that would give them the sort of lift-off that they want for their conference. But again, Keir Starmer, not a man famed as being an inspiring speaker, that he needs to put some flesh on the bones of what Labour would actually do in power. They've defined themselves reasonably well as not being the Tories, but I don't think still the nation has got much of a vision of what a Labour government would look like. And if you talk to people around Keir Starmer, they'll tell you we'll start to see some of the actual policies, the retail sell to the public, that they'll put for them in the next election.
Look, there are two Labour conferences, Schrodinger's Labour conference. If they win in Rutherglen, I think that might put them onto a steady path that could take them to an overall majority. But if they lose on Thursday night, Friday morning, which they don't expect, then I think it will be hard. Labour conference will be the inverse of this week. It will be all about the leader. And he does have to do something, show a new gear that he hasn't shown before. Now, they have been prepping for this since early August. They know that this is one of the very few platforms that they've had. They're throwing everything at it. So, over to you guys.
Well, we'll be listening tonight for you more analysis. That's it for this Sunday morning with Trevor Phillips from our oasis here in Manchester. We'll be with Liverpool next week. Thank you for spending so much of your time with us on Sunday morning. Join us again next Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Bye.
This is Sky News. It's 10 o'clock. The headlines. The Prime Minister faces his first conference as leader under pressure from senior Conservatives and his own cabinet to cut tax.
Yes, no, I would like to see the tax burden reduced before the next election.
Breaking news, and authorities in Turkey say a suicide bomber has detonated an explosive device near the Interior Ministry in the capital, Ankara. The Defence Secretary considers increasing support for Ukraine and putting British armed forces on the ground to help train its soldiers. Some of Britain's biggest retailers demand tougher action to protect shop workers. Plus, what does vaping really do to your body? The new study that aims to find out. Good morning.